Good morning, everybody. So thank you for joining this session. The session is obviously about assessment centres. So what we're going to do is we're going to tell you a little bit about ourselves here at Arcadis, and then do obviously the session with regards to assessment centres. So we've got some time at the end as well for some Q&As, and there's the option for you to send some questions through in the chat as well. So we can use that facility if you've got any questions, but then we'll answer those at the very end as well. So let's get started, I suppose. So let me introduce myself. My name is John Turner, and I am the recruitment manager for our early careers programs here at Arcadis. And we've also got my colleague Tracy on the call too. And between us, we're going to give you a little bit of information, say about Arcadis, what we do, who we are, our culture, and then probably, and what you're more interested in is some hints and tips on the assessment centres themselves. So Tracy, can I hand over to you and you can introduce yourself, and then we'll get started.
Thanks, John. Yeah, so as John said, I'm Tracy Buchan. I'm the early careers recruitment consultant at Arcadis and work alongside John in that early careers space. If we could have the next slide, please. So we are the leading design and consultancy for natural and built assets. And we work with our clients to deliver their vision across consultancy, engineering, project and management services. And as you can see there, we've got a very wide geographical spread. So I'll just leave you there to have a look at the numbers there. In total, we number around 28,000. And as you can see there, true worldwide business. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So here is a high level of the sectors that we work in. So infrastructure, water, buildings and environment, and you don't need me to read out the different sectors underneath that. I'll just leave that for a second for you to read down. John, are you going to let people know a little bit more about our culture?
Brilliant, thank you. So go to the next slide, please. So we're not going to talk too much about ourselves, I promise you, but we thought it was worth you having a little bit of knowledge about what it's like here at Arcadis and the sort of company that we are. So we thought we'd tell you a little bit about, obviously, some of the things which Tracy's just touched on there, so you get a feeling for the size of the organisation. But I just wanted to touch on as well a little bit about the type of organisation that we are and what we call our people first culture. So a lot of companies will tell you that they care about their staff and the communities that they're working in. Absolutely, most do. However, at Arcadis, it absolutely kind of runs through and underpins everything that we do right across the organisation, from the very top to the very bottom. Absolutely everybody, from our leadership right through to the apprentices and the graduates who join us, are really encouraged to play their part in developing what we call this people first culture. So as you can see there, as the slide is showing you, we support various charities. We also have various internal programs that support our staff, and our staff are actively encouraged to participate and drive some of these initiatives. So if you look at the initiatives there, they're just some of the ones that you guys can get involved in from the very start of it. And like I say, it's not just lip service. Again, it's really something that we want you guys to drive, and we want our staff to drive upon entering our business. So again, EDI is a really important at Arcadis, and we're recognised for the work that we've done in this field. So you can see there some of the awards that we've won. So like one example of this people first culture is how the business it sent mass home at the very beginning of the pandemic. I'm sure you're sick of hearing the word pandemic and the word COVID, but at the very, very beginning of it, the business sent home mass to everybody. There was no expectation that anybody was to travel for work. These are literally just for our own personal uses. So again, that's just one of those things there that the business did to support that people first culture. And obviously as well, I'm sure you've heard of the Nightingale hospitals. So we helped to deliver a lot of those Nightingales on a pro bono basis. So we did that free of charge using our project management and our cost consulting skills. So a lot of our staff were involved in the setup of those Nightingale hospitals. Again, so that hopefully just tells you what we're doing to drive that people first culture, both within our business, but within the community itself as well. So can we have the next slide, please? So assessment centres, that's what you're really here to listen about, I suppose. So let's say a little bit about the assessment centres. So assessment centres are usually the kind of the final stage or very end stage of the recruitment process that you'll come through. And if you've reached this stage, you've already done really well. You know, the employer thinks you've got great potential. You know, when you're close to being offered a job at this stage, you've probably passed a lot of the preliminary tests that they've done. You'll have the right qualifications. You've probably got some of the right experiences that they're looking for at this stage. So if you're at this stage already, you've already done really well. And you should be mindful of that. So the assessment centres, how long do they last? So they'll tend to last anywhere between half a day and some of them even up to 2 days, depending on the organisation. It's probably very unlikely. We will touch on virtual assessment centres throughout this, but because of what's happening at the moment, the vast majority of assessment centres that you'll be attending probably for the next 12 months are going to be virtual. So it's very unlikely that you're going to be doing a 2-day session, but it could be done 2 days online, for example. So they can involve various activities, and again, we'll cover those activities off later in the slides, and they'll involve multiple assessors as well. So your performance in each of the activity will be evaluated, very often by different assessors. So you'll get different assessors potentially even looking at the same behaviours so that they can understand exactly kind of what it is that you're good at. And obviously as well, it'll include a number of candidates. So you won't be on your own in these assessment centres. You may be asked to work in groups, and some tasks you might be able to work on, you'll obviously be able to work on your own as well. But it really does depend on the organisation and the type of activities that they're doing from there. So assessment centres can be anything from a couple of people. We're doing some virtual assessment centres at the moment where we've got 6 people in those assessment centres, but they can literally be up to hundreds of people. If you were doing maybe some with the large professional services organisations, some of their assessment centres will literally have hundreds of people in them, and then you'll be breaking out into various different rooms and into groups. So that's a little bit of a kind of about how the size of those from there. There's some social activities as well, which will very often happen within the assessment centres, whether they be after the assessment centre and quite often during the assessment centre as well. Do you want to have a pop to the next slide for me, please? So this slide really is just to give you a little bit of a difference and to give you some context around the difference between what would be a face-to-face and virtual assessment centres. So obviously times have changed and more companies are using their online tools to assess candidates. The situation with regards to COVID-19 at the moment will mean that most companies who weren't previously using virtual platforms will now look to move their assessment centres online. So we've been doing face-to-face assessment centres for a number of years, but we've started doing virtual interviews. So the assessment centre was always face-to-face. The actual, not sure what that is. Is this music? So yeah, we've been doing face-to-face assessment centres, but been having virtual interviews for a few years now, but everything will be moving virtually for there. So like I said, for the foreseeable future, it's likely that all the assessment centres that you will be doing will be completed virtually. But the general principles of virtual assessment centres are exactly the same as it is if it's a face-to-face one, but there's some subtle differences and things that you might want to consider. So you shouldn't prepare any less or ultimately any different for virtual environments as you should for face-to-face, but there are some things that you should consider too. So prepare as you would for a face-to-face or in person. You'll need to do your research, understand the role that you've applied to, have a passion and a keen interest for the role in that company, and the organisation will expect you to be able to show that. But being online, like I say, won't change most of this, but you should also prepare slightly differently and take into account a whole host of things. So technology, make sure that your technology works, and make sure you know in advance in what format it'll take, what's the most appropriate place to do it, dressing appropriately, what should you wear, and be mindful as well of how you come across on camera. So make sure you use some of that positive body language, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Try out in advance, and practice makes perfect. So they're just some high-level things that you want to try and do. So in terms of trying it out in advance, so a few days before your assessment centre, you should test your device and your software, make sure that you've been asked to use, and make sure that the picture's clear and the sound is good. And again, on the day, ensure everything is fully charged and plugged in. You don't want the battery to be running down halfway through an interview, for example. And again, thinking about where you're going to actually do it yourself. So it's worth planning in advance where you're going to do your assessment. It's always best to use a quiet place, somewhere where you won't be disturbed by noises and people. I've got a dog, and my dog isn't barking. I've put him away upstairs, so we're not going to be disturbed there. And I've packed my children off to school as well, so we're not going to be disturbed by my children as well. But really important that when you're doing an assessment that, you as minimal interruptions as possible, you're obviously going to have the Amazon guy potentially turn up or something like that, and that's absolutely fine, and don't worry about that. If it is the case and that's happening halfway through your assessment, literally just a case of having to say to whoever's hosting it, sorry, there's somebody at my door, can just pop away for a few minutes. Everybody's in exactly the same situation, so don't be scared or afraid to say something like that. And dressing appropriately as well. So you may be at home, but it's still effectively a job interview or you're doing an assessment. So a good rule of thumb is to wear the same outfit that you would if it was a face-to-face interview. I talked earlier about that positive body language, and you really need to be thoughtful about your body language. You still want to appear engaged, and you'd be surprised how many people on video don't treat interviews properly. So you'll see people that just seem disengaged, they're not looking at the screen. They'll be fidgeting or fiddling, and it really is surprising when you see somebody like that. And I think on a camera lens, and the end of a camera, it's actually emphasized more. So just be mindful of that when you're doing that as well. So can we go to the next slide, please? That's okay. So Tracy, do you want to touch on some of these parts for us?
Okay, so just picking up on some of the bits that John was saying there. So research, ensure you read all the information from the employer carefully, as this will tell you what to expect at the assessment centre, what competencies or behaviours the employer will be looking for. Note that the activities involved and whether you have to prepare anything in advance, such as a presentation. And if you're not clear about anything at all, make sure you contact the employer for clarification. It's always better to be safe rather than sorry, and ask a question that you may think is, even if the information is contained within the email or whatever you've been sent, it's better to ask and double check. We're much happier that happens than people be unprepared on the day. In terms of preparation, if you know you're going to be doing a psychometric testing, for example, as part of the assessment, ask the employer what type of psychometric test it will be, and then, if possible, do some practice tests 1 or 2 weeks ahead of it, so you're comfortable with the testing and what's expected. If you don't know what activities that you will be performing, you can't be prepared, and you don't want to be coming across that at the first time at the interview or assessment. We've got down there to review, so that's to look over your application form and the job details, the company information. Look at the employer's website, for example, what news, what's happening in their world, news websites, newspaper cuttings for current issues, anything that's going to give you a better insight into the company. Other students may, on things like Glassdoor, etc., other students' descriptions of assessment centres. So, you've got a better feel for what to expect when you arrive at that event. If you are travelling, so if you are doing a face-to-face, ensure that you know exactly where you're going. It sounds daft, but you'd be surprised the number of people that leave it till the actual day and then realise they're not quite sure where the venue is, or, that they've got to get a connecting train and it delays their travel and makes them late. So make sure that you've kind of got all those practical matters, such as where you're journeying, if you're driving, is there parking, all those kinds of things, to make sure that you arrive early. It's better to be half an hour early than 5 minutes late. And when it is virtual, I think John's already sort of captured this actually, it's just about making sure that you are in the right environment, because at the end of the day, you'll be more relaxed and able to perform better if you know that everything's working, that you're in an environment where you're not going to be disturbed, and you can really give your best there. Go to the next slide, please. So whether it's face-to-face or virtual, you need to be professional. So like I said, arrive in good time. If you are delayed, and delays do happen, I did an assessment last December where there were huge train cancellations, and that was completely out of the candidate's control. But as long as people let you know, then you can kind of accommodate that. So be polite to everyone you meet, stay calm and focused and positive throughout the process. Talk to other candidates. Sometimes it can be a little bit awkward, you're kind of sizing each other up, etc. And some people don't find small talk very easy. But you've all going through shared experiences, like courses, universities, other assessments you might have attended. So use those as a basis for conversation if you're struggling for something else to say. Take time to think when you've given a task. Take a few minutes to read and reread instructions carefully. If there's something there you don't understand, ask. Don't be tempted to just launch straight into an event or an exercise, but make sure that you're kind of mentally prepared and really understand what the requirements of that task is. If necessary, make notes or highlight, use bits of paper or the instructions themselves if you're allowed to write on those, do so. The next one's really important. It's very easy to think that you've made a mistake, but if that is the case, don't dwell on perceived failures. The reality is you're not quite sure what the assessors are looking for. Something that you may think is an absolute big boo-boo, they may have either not noticed or are not concerned about. It's how you recover from these things as well. Mistakes are part of everyday life. They'll happen when you join a company. So how you come out and how you conduct yourself after that is the most important thing, and what the assessors will be looking for. And don't compare yourself to others. You're not... Again, it's about that perception about how you think people are coming over, but assessors may be seeing things differently. You're not competing with each other either. You're kind of like in it together. So don't treat others as competition, just as fellow candidates. Next slide, please. So employers will use various activities to assess skills and abilities. So that could be group exercises, in-tray or e-tray exercises, presentations, case studies, psychometric testing, social activities. They're mostly interested in your skills and career motivation. For certain jobs, they may also want to assess technical or specialist knowledge, and assessment centres should provide the ideal opportunity for you to demonstrate all of these. So obviously, each employer will use various different exercises, so I'm just going to go through a couple of them in a little bit more detail for you, things that you might come across. So group exercises, they generally involve as it says really, a group of candidates where you'll be given a brief generally, and then certain defined objectives on that brief, and be expected to work together to achieve the activity. So it's about kind of like teamwork, working together, communication, all those things that I'm sure you're very adept at. In-tray exercises, these simulate business situations. Typically, you're a newly appointed manager, and there are many issues, both on paper and electronically, demanding your attention, such as reports, memos, letters, emails, etc., and you'll be required to respond. You may sometimes be given the opportunity to discuss the exercise with an assessor at the end, and the main skills required in this is to understand and analyse complex information, time management, and your communication skills. In terms of presentations, generally you'll be given a topic either on the day or a few days beforehand in order that you can prepare, and your audience is likely to include the assessors or perhaps other candidates. And it should be made clear to you what equipment, visual aids, etc. will be available. So you'll be told, for example, if you'll have access to a laptop, or if you need to do it in a PowerPoint presentation, or if you'll just do the flip chart. However, you should be told that all ahead of time. So case studies. These are either written responses on a discussion, such as a role play with an assessor about a dilemma or a problem that they'll present to you, and it's likely related to the organisation's business and contain a lot of information and have more than one element to consider. Depending on the industry, there may also be some facts and figures which you may need to analyse and take into account in order to draw your conclusions. The questions posed by case studies are designed to be multifaceted and require some real thought and give you the opportunity to solve problems. Don't worry, there generally isn't an obvious solution. Assessors are generally looking just for how you cope with the situation and your thought processes behind, rather than the ideal solution. So in terms of, so can we move on to the next slide? Thank you. So in terms of what assessors are looking for, it's generally things like communication skills, teamwork, collaboration. They're looking for resilience. So when things do go wrong, how do you manage that, etc., and motivation. So if we just take one of those for an example there. So if we were looking at verbal communication skills, and this is a dictionary definition that I'm going to read to you here, so bear with me. Communication means demonstrating the ability to express ideas clearly, convincingly, and concisely, to articulate complex ideas in a simple and meaningful manner, to influence others through the use of conviction and enthusiasm. So that's the kind of like the skill set. So the assessors will be looking for indicators whether you have that skill set or not. So positive indicators they'll be looking for are things such as speaking clearly, being confident, displaying conviction, and ensuring that others understand your ideas by, you know, checking in with them and justifying that your opinion has persuaded others. But whereas negative indicators would be things like being unclear, not expressing yourself, being hesitant, lacking enthusiasm, and failing to persuade others. So that's just a kind of like a skill and how those skills would be measured by an assessor. Next slide, please.
Brilliant, thanks for that, Tracy. I think that was great. And don't forget, if you've got any questions about anything that Tracy's just mentioned there, you can obviously put that into the Q&A facility, and we'll have a chat about those later on. So very often, oh sorry, are we on the next? Yeah, we're on the right side here now. Thank you. So very often, the final stage of the application process or an assessment centre ends with an interview. Okay, and the two most common interview techniques and processes that you'll come against are what we call a strengths-based approach, and then we have what's called a competency-based approach as well. So strengths-based interviews focus on what you enjoy doing rather than what you can do. So there's a subtle difference there, and we'll go into a little bit more detail about it in a bit. Don't be fooled, however, whilst you're talking about what you like and what you dislike, the employer is learning a lot about you and what you're good at. So they'll ask questions which may even have a yes or no answer, and they'll be really punchy and they'll be quite quick in terms of pace as well. So what they're trying to find out really is what you're naturally good at, and you may get asked an awful lot of questions in a strengths interview. In a 40-minute interview, you might get asked 20 or 30 questions, and there might not even be the opportunity to follow up on some of those questions. But like I said, what they're doing is by asking you lots of questions and the pace of that interview being really quick, they find out what you're naturally good at and what are your innate strengths. So a lot of professional services firms are using strengths-based techniques, because if you're going to be joining a professional services firm and you're going to be going on and doing your technical education after it, so you might have finished university, for example, with a history degree, but you might be going on doing an accountancy course. They don't want to know how good you are at accountancy courses because they don't expect you to be at the moment. What they want to know is, do you have the ability to be able to pass those accountancy courses? Do you have the ability to communicate properly and to have strengths in certain manners that you won't have already had experiences about? But what they want to know is, do those things come naturally to you? A competency-based interview, and what these are generally doing is these are testing your skills or past behaviours. So these questions will give the interviewer an opportunity to ask follow-up questions to your initial response, and they'll dig deeper into those skills and those competencies that they talked to you about. And we'll go into a little bit more detail now about about some techniques that you can use during both strengths and competency-based interviews. So do you want to go to the next slide for me, please? So I'm not going to talk in loads of detail about this, because you'll be able to find loads of information online about the STAR technique. So basically, the STAR technique is used within competency-based interviews. So you may get asked a question, something along the lines of, tell me about a time when you've experienced being under pressure. And you can use any scenario that you want. So you might want to use a time when you've been at work or at university, or even in a part-time job, for example. And what they want you to do is to explain the situation, the task at hand, the action that you did, how did you overcome that, and then what was the end result? So that's a kind of a methodology that you should really use and have mindful and have in the back of your mind when answering a competency-based question. Okay. So what I would suggest you do really is just go online and find out about competency interviews. And if you Google it, without a doubt, you'll find out about what's called the STAR technique there to be able to answer those. Okay. So do you want to go to the next slide for me, please? So the strengths things, the strengths questions that you will come up against. So these are becoming increasingly popular. I will probably say 80 to 90% of people, of organisations, are using competency-based techniques, but particularly in the early careers environment, so people like yourselves, strengths-based is becoming more and more popular, because it's about assessing potential rather than what you've done in the past or what you can do, which is obviously where the vast majority of people in early careers, that's where you are in terms different at both your academic and career level. So identify your own strengths. It's really good to know what you do well. When do you feel more like yourself? When are you at your best? What do you enjoy most? These are the sort of things which you should start to identify about yourself and understand about yourself, because those are your strengths. Okay, and honesty and authenticity, that's a really important aspect of answering strengths-based techniques as well. So be absolutely honest. Tell them what you're thinking rather than what you think they want to hear. This will mean that you'll come across as much more authentic, and people trained in strengths interview techniques will be able to see if what you're saying isn't true or authentic. So they may ask you a question, and if you're having to ponder the answer and think about the answer, it's obvious that that's not a natural strength to you. So you may then say something, but actually that moment's gone, and they probably don't think that it is a natural strength for you, if that makes sense. So how you say it absolutely matters as well within strengths-based techniques. So strengths-based interviews are based upon the premise that someone has a genuine interest and strengths in certain areas, and you'll be much more suitable for a certain role. So if those interests don't match the role, it's not the end of the world. What it actually means is that it's probably not the right role for you anyway, because if they're asking you to do things which you don't necessarily enjoy or come naturally to you, you're probably not going to be at your best in that role anyway. And if you're not good at something, don't be afraid to say so, but try to turn it into a positive as well. And it's really important that you use like words and cues like, I love it, I'm really good at it, it excites me. It's not my, or again, if it's more of a negative thing and it's not something that you're great at, try and turn it into that positive by saying something like, it's not my strongest strength, it's not what I'm necessarily the best at, however, and then try and put that positive slant on it from there. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this is really, excuse me. So this is really important as well. People don't necessarily think about this when they're doing assessments. And if you've had if you've done your assessment centre and then you get a message saying, unfortunately, we're not going to be taking your application forward, or we're not going to be making you a job offer. It's really easy to look at that as a negative. I mean, obviously, it's not the best result that you've got, because you're wanting to obviously get a job or to get a role. But it's really important that you take your feedback properly. Okay, what I would suggest you do after an assessment centre is make as many notes. If there's something which you think you didn't prepare well for, make a note of it. So when you're doing your next assessment centre, you're absolutely preparing yourself for that sort of scenario. And the feedback is really important as well. Most companies will offer feedback to you if you request it. And it's really important. I would definitely recommend that you take this feedback, because what they will do is they'll tell you what you did well. And so, they're great, but you probably don't need to prepare as hard for those aspects at the next assessment centre as what you would for the areas where you didn't perform so strongly. So absolutely make sure that you get your feedback as well. And obviously, if you are lucky enough to have done well in the assessment centre and you get an offer, make sure, that you have a real good conversation with somebody about that. You may have a number of competing offers, and it's not always about what is maybe the highest salary or is the location necessarily right for you. Really have a think about what the offer entails and what the program is. Some programs might offer much more development for you. They may offer professional qualifications. They may help you towards chartership much more. You may have a wider breadth of opportunities or experiences that you would gather with one role for another, but one role might be paying you slightly more, for example. So it's really important that when you take receipt of that offer, that you understand exactly what it is that you're being offered and what you're signing up for as well. Okay, can we go to the next slide, please? So Tracy, do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, I'm conscious, John, that we've just over a minute left, so I'll quickly fly through this and then anyone have a chance to have any questions. So in terms of what we're looking for, so we recruit graduates, so year outs and summer placements across a breadth of programs. So we're looking for things like growth mindsets, resilience, innovation, and alignment to our values, because we know that they're the people that are going to fit best with our company and be happiest and fit in really well. Sorry, John, should we quickly
let's go to the next slide?
Let's go to the next slide.
Brilliant. So hopefully you've liked what you've heard, and you're interested in finding out a little bit more about us at Arcadis as well. If you go to our website, we have what we call a register your interest opportunity there. Our opportunities aren't open and won't open until the new year. But if you register your interest now, we'll make sure that we send you details about when our positions open, but we'll also send you updates about what's happening here at Arcadis as well. So if you have enjoyed what you've heard and want to find out a little bit more, Google's a great place to go to find out about your assessment centres. There's loads of stuff on the Prospects website as well. And again, I think I'm happy for you to reach out to me on LinkedIn as well, and I'm sure Trace is exactly the same.
Just quickly, Kate's asked one question: how many candidates? So with ours, it varies from about 20, but you can have over 100, as John said earlier. So it just depends on the actual company. So you can find that out. So if you get invited to an assessment centre, it's perfectly acceptable for you to ask because they run different formats and different sizes. Do you feel introverts are at a disadvantage in assessment centres? No, we're looking at the whole thing. So we're looking at a whole raft of qualities. So obviously introverts can be a little bit more uncomfortable, but they've got lots of skills, etc. The assessment centres are designed to pull out all of the skills required to fulfil the role. So it's not about being the loudest person in the room.
And we won't expect you to be great at everything or to be really good at everything as well. So different organisations may be taking anywhere on between 10 and 1,000 people. They don't want either their 10 or their 1,000 people to be exactly the same. So it's really about playing to your strengths and playing about what you're good at. So if you are a little bit more introverted than somebody else, it won't put you at a disadvantage at all. What I would definitely recommend that you do is that you take your opportunities. So during a group exercise, you might not be the person who speaks the most, but make sure that what you're saying has real impact and is absolutely valid. That'll be much more important than just saying a lot of words. So hopefully that helps, Sam. Any more questions at all? No? Okay, well, I hope you've, like I say, that you found that interesting. And, you know, if anybody does think of any questions, if you, like I say, you can reach out to us on LinkedIn. But we also have an early years careers at arcadis.com email address where you can reach out to us as well. So if you email that, that'll definitely make its way to Tracy or I. So we'll stay on for a couple more minutes if anybody asks any more questions. Otherwise, thank you for joining today. We really appreciate it. And best of luck when you do come up to those assessment centres.
Thanks, everyone.